Hound of the Baskervilles was just a regular Mastiff coated in phosphorus to make it glow in the dark. This was done by the victim's neighbor, who was secretly a descendant of the Baskerville family in a plot to get his hands on the estate. Spooky monster, glow-in-the-dark paint, a friend who turns out to be the bad guy. This sounds like something right out of an episode of Scooby-Doo! And spoilers for the following Scooby-Doo episodes.
Scooby, Scooby-Doo, Scooby, Scooby-Doo.
The gang travels to the moors of Scotland to investigate the disappearance of a flock of sheep at the behest of their owner, the local lord. They learn that the aristocrats' ancestors had once almost been driven to ruin by the curse of an otherworldly hound, which now appears to have returned to finish the job. That night while sleeping, Scooby goes missing and soon becomes the prime suspect.
Oh, you take the high road, and I'll take the low road. I'll keep the spot in the fire. The bleak and the true road will never move again. From the running wreck, rough road.
The gang are singing a traditional Scottish folk song called the Bonnie Banks o' Loch Lomond, referring to the largest lake in Scotland. This might also finally explain this joke to some of you.
Loch 1, Loch 2, Loch 3, Loch Lomond.
Barkerville Hall, 2 kilometers.
Say, isn't Barkerville the guy who makes those Barker weave sweaters?
Right. If we don't find out who's rustling his sheep, there won't be any more sweaters.
This line took me some time to figure out, because while it was clearly another dog-related pun, I couldn't immediately place it. This is probably a duh moment on my part, but I'm not exactly a fashionista, as anyone could tell with a quick glance at the rows of identical black t-shirts in my closet. Barker weave is likely a reference to basket weave, which is a type of pattern common in the textile industry, including sweaters. Bentley was the caretaker of Barkerville Hall, working directly under its owner, Lord Barkerville. At some point, Bentley discovered the will of Barkerville's great-grandfather, Cedric, which stipulated that if the Barkerville family ever became destitute, ownership of the entire estate would be transferred to the caretaker.
Hey, you guys, look!
What's that?
This is old Cedric Barkerville's will.
Cedric?
Helicopter.
To gain control of Barkerville Hall and its surrounding lands, Bentley decided to cripple his employer's business through sabotage.
Sabotage? How? When?
He did so by stealing the sheep that produced the wool used by Lord Barkerville's sweater company, leaving them without the raw materials needed to manufacture their product. Taking advantage of the legend of the family curse, Bentley convinced Lord Barkerville that the livestock had been taken by the Hound of the Barkervilles.
Don't play innocent, you sheep stealer, you!
Oh, me?
Down with the hound! Down with the hound! Down with the hound!
After the gang's arrival, Bentley hypnotized Scooby with a special ultrasonic ring, which, presumably, emitted sound that could only be heard by dogs. This somehow made Scooby susceptible to suggestion, though in the episode, we only ever saw him walk around in a daze like he was sleepwalking. This also put Scooby at the scene of the crime with no explanation for his actions, prompting Lord Barkerville and his angry mob of shepherds to blame the Great Dane for the missing sheep. This was not the first episode that involved cattle rustling or even smuggling sheep. It was also not the first episode that involved members of the gang being hypnotized, nor someone being manipulated into thinking they were a humanoid beast creature. It's also not the first time a member of the Scooby Gang had been suspected of being the monster, though this may be one of the first times we've seen any of them directly framed for a crime. Scooby being chased by the angry mob in To Switch a Witch was more a matter of him being in the wrong place at the wrong time, rather than the villain purposely putting the dog in danger. The writers didn't just borrow from older episodes of Scooby-Doo either. Obviously, Hound of the Scoobyvilles was directly inspired by Arthur Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles, though that story was set in Dartmoor in the south of England, while this one took place in Scotland, all the way on the opposite side of the island. And while no original Sherlock Holmes story was centered on cattle rustling, the adventure of Silver Blaze did involve a nobleman's trusted employee messing with his sheep, though the bad guy in that story maimed the animals instead of stealing them. Coincidentally, that story also took place in Dartmoor. There was even a Sherlock Holmes story, The Musgrave Ritual, that centered around a head butler conspiring against his master after discovering a valuable family secret contained in old paperwork. Come to think of it, using sound to train an animal for a criminal act was also part of the villain's plan in yet another Holmes work, The Adventure of the Speckled Band. While the repeated use of elements from previous Scooby episodes would usually result in point deductions for the lack of originality, and this may sound hypocritical of me, but I feel all the references to the Sherlock Holmes stories canceled out the negatives. The writers haven't included the literary detective in earlier seasons, in particular the robot version of Holmes in The Night Ghoul of Wonderworld. However, that was a gross oversimplification of the character and merely presented him with all his commonly accepted stereotypes. Here, though, apart from the title and setting, the Sherlock Holmes elements were much more subtle and would be a bit of a reward for any child viewer who might later discover the Conan Doyle stories and recognize what was done in this episode. That's not to say the writers get a complete pass on the design of the villain's plot, especially as the key element of the scheme made zero sense when given even the barest scrutiny.
Bentley! But why?
It's all right here in old Cedric Barkerville's will.
Oh, so now it's Cedric.
He said that if the House of Barkerville should ever fall, then the entire estate goes to your caretaker.
That's Bentley!
Bentley's goal was to gain ownership of the Barkerville estate by driving his master to ruin, which would have forced the conditions of the ancestor's will to kick in, transferring the deed to the caretaker. Shouldn't Lord Barkerville have known about that clause in his ancestor's will if it was still in effect? You would think his father or grandfather would have mentioned just how important it was to keep the family's finances in order if it meant losing their ancestral grounds otherwise. And knowing that, you would think Barkerville would have been able to put two and two together and immediately suspect Bentley if anything went wrong, since that man was the one who would have most benefited if the family were pauperized. The dude clearly wasn't that smart. Of course, in general, this isn't even how a will works. I need to stress that I am not a lawyer. I have a conscience. But I have dealt with wills and trusts and property deeds over the years, so I have some relevant insight. I am also from the United States, not the United Kingdom, so it's always possible wills work differently over there. The sole purpose of a will is to disperse one's property after their death. It lists the assets held by the deceased and how and to whom they want them distributed. While it's not unheard of for wills to contain conditions an inheritor must meet in order to be declared valid, like spending the night in a haunted mansion, generally these terms only apply to the initial heir for a specified duration. Once the property has been transferred, the new owner can usually do whatever the hell they want with it. It's also unlikely that a term as vague as "if the house should ever fall" would survive a court challenge. After all, how do you define that condition? Even if a noble family loses all its money, as long as it still manages to produce descendants, it could be said that their house hasn't technically fallen. Despite their last royal member having died in 1922, the House of Habsburg still has living members to this day. It's also questionable as to how this condition of the document would have even applied to the current Lord Barkerville, considering it was his great-grandfather's will. This implies the estate passed through not only his father's hands, but his grandfather's as well, casting significant doubt upon the legal relevancy of Cedric's intentions. There are two ways one can ensure their intentions are enforced long after they die. Cedric could have established a trust that managed the estate for his descendants, and one of the conditions for them to remain in Barkerville Hall could have been if they upheld a certain level of income, either a dollar amount that could be adjusted for inflation or a certain percentage of the estate's appraised value. The other method is to use what are called restrictive covenants. For instance, a landowner could establish a nature preserve by adding a clause to their deed that no trees are ever allowed to be cut down. Restrictive covenants can be more difficult to enforce than a trust, as it would require a second party to file legal action against the property owner should they break the terms. If no one complains, nothing is usually done. Restrictive covenants are also easier to remove through legislative action, should any condition set by the former property owner no longer conform to the law. Here's an example of that from my own personal experience. At one of my jobs, I have seen quite a few property abstracts over the years. An abstract is a book collecting all the deeds and title transfers for a specific piece of real estate, frequently allowing one to trace the chain of possession from the current owner all the way back to when the land was not only undeveloped, but was located in what was considered a territory rather than a state. I still recall one for a house located in what would be best called an exclusive neighborhood for my area of the Midwest. Some of the oldest pages of the abstract contained deed copies literally specifying that only white people would be allowed to reside there. Yeah, as much as I mock the American South, that's not the only place you can find racist assholes. Obviously, because of laws passed since the time those deeds were drafted, that particular restrictive covenant is no longer legally enforceable. It's also dubious that Cedric Barkerville's will would have included a clause like that in the first place. While there's no accounting for eccentricities when it comes to the wealthy, would the great-grandfather really have included instructions to disinherit titled family members in favor of unnamed commoners? If the will had been referencing whoever the caretaker was when Barkerville had still been alive, that would have made some sense. The old lord might have admired the man and wanted to create an incentive for his children to work hard or risk losing their home. But he would have had no idea what kind of man any future caretaker might have been. For this clause to have been carried forward 3 generations later is ludicrous.
Ludicrous!
My point is that no matter what the old will stated, it was very unlikely that Bentley's plan would have ever actually succeeded, as any competent lawyer hired by Lord Barkerville would tear it to shreds. Not that it would have ever had a chance to reach that point, either. Think about it. The condition for Bentley to gain ownership of the estate was if the family fell to ruin. If the Barkervilles had to declare bankruptcy or were otherwise beset with creditors demanding payment, Barkerville Hall would absolutely be seized and sold off to satisfy those debts. In fact, the land would probably be one of the first things sold or mortgaged by the family to keep financially afloat. No matter what a centuries-old will might say, the courts would absolutely give ownership to the bank if a mortgage on the property was ever in default. As much as I enjoy Sherlock Holmes and seeing the references to the canon here, any high score I might have given was mostly canceled out by the insurmountably critical flaw in Bentley's plan. He gets a 2 out of 5 for the design. While watching this episode, I was tempted to lump the Hound of the Barkervilles in the same category as a werewolf. I mean, just look at it. That is clearly a werewolf. Except I won't, because technically a werewolf would be a human that transforms into a wolf creature under certain conditions. The Hound here is just a bipedal canine, which, as we are all well aware, isn't exactly rare for the Scooby-Doo-niverse. Dogs have also been used by Scooby villains before, but usually they're actual dogs meant to guard a hideout, whereas this is the first time that the disguise itself was a dog. So a point for that. As for being scary, well, that's harder to say. If you're afraid of dogs in general, yeah, that's going to do it for you. Hell, in the original Hound of the Baskerville story, one of the victims died of fright simply seeing the devil hound on the moors, so there's no accounting for what someone will find frightening. I'm probably letting my own bias show if I'm too hard on Bentley's costume. Sitting back and trying to see through the average person's eyes, I think it's safe to say the Hound was scary. The fangs and claws were effective, as was the yellow, pupilless eyes, though the latter were the only thing that could be immediately considered supernatural with the costume. You can't give it credit for being big and walking upright because, as mentioned, Scooby-Doo-niverse. There is, though, definitely something to be said for how eerie the silhouette was for the Hound, as seen here. Certainly worth a point for style, but still ultimately boring and with nothing that really stood out. Obviously, as Bentley's scheme focused on ruining his employer's fortunes, he had no practical choice but to utilize the Barkerville family's curse. Despite not having the leeway for an alternate outfit, what he came up with was still appropriate. But would it have killed him to dress things up a bit more? The original Hound from the Sherlock Holmes story included using phosphorus for a glowing effect. Why didn't Bentley do the same? It's not like he wasn't wearing a full bodysuit and had to worry about getting any of the chemical on him that could be used to incriminate him later. Or worse, developing Fosse jaw. Mostly original, mostly scary, and absolutely appropriate, though lacking in special effects and somewhat plain, I am compelled to give The Hound of the Barkervilles an outfit score of 3 out of 5. By the time the Scooby Gang arrived, Bentley's plan to ruin Lord Barkerville was well into action, with plenty of sheep missing and his employer already blaming his family curse for the loss.
The Hound of the Barkervilles, which came by night, devouring all the sheep.
What a pig!
Ho-ho! That's rich coming from you, Shaggy.
Yeah!
Move over.
Aw, come on, guys.
It's not the Wickles effect because he's not currently in costume, but Bentley is easily carrying close to 300 pounds on his back while simultaneously carrying 3 suitcases in his left hand.
So, your hound stole my sheep.
The reason the gang were even invited to Barkerville Hall was to investigate the missing sheep. Why would the old man have accused Scooby, who had just arrived? The dude clearly wasn't that smart.
Look, it's the hound.
They're after Uncle Scooby. They are?
Scooby has the worst luck with torch-carrying mobs. It's unlikely that Bentley would have known when he started his scheme that the Scooby Gang would eventually be called in, allowing him a chance to bolster his plan with a convenient scapegoat. It's not like Daphne or the rest were established friends of Lord Barkerville, and who would have thought the old man would have contacted investigators from the States to take on his case? Something like this does earn a villain kudos for improvisation, though I still question what we saw on screen.
Here we go again.
Like, how did Bentley put Scooby in that trance?
I have the answer to that. He used this ultrasonic ring.
Oh no, Scoob! Not again!
This is very similar to the cat medallion that had entranced Daphne's Aunt Olivia when that item made an eerie sound that should not have been heard, since no explanation had ever been given as to how it generated the noise. The ring in this episode, at least, was meant to make sound, but presumably one that could only be heard by animals with the ability to hear high frequencies, like dogs. None of the humans, including most of the audience, should have been able to hear anything. I'll wave this away like I did the cat medallion because it was an ambiance choice made by the producers.
Here we go again.
Wait a minute. Here we go again? That implies that Scooby remembered getting hypnotized the first time. So why didn't he tell Daphne and Shaggy what had happened? That seemed like important information he should have conveyed. I am less forgiving, however, as to how Scrappy never appeared to be affected by the ring's sound. Granted, he didn't seem to be nearby the 2 times that Bentley had used the ring against Scooby, but he's right there next to everyone else when Lord Barkerville shows the gang his discovery. I suppose it's possible he did get mesmerized like Scooby off camera, but it just goes to show that the producers had a habit of not treating Scrappy the same as Scooby whenever anything happened specific to dogs, like how the former is generally drawn bipedal while the latter is always on all 4s, or how Scrappy only wore fins on his rear legs while Scooby wore them on both sets.
The hound! Over there! Come on! Come on! Get the hound! Get the hound! Get the hound! Gentlemen, our worries are over. I've caught the hound!
If my Uncle Scooby's the hound, then who's that?
While we're on the subject of Bentley framing Scooby, what was the point of him doing that when he wore the hound costume while in the same location and then carelessly allowed himself to be seen against the bright moonlight while the mob had their hands on Scooby? Overall, Bentley never made any fatal mistakes in the episode. He never drew unnecessary attention to himself while carrying out his scheme, and he couldn't have known Lord Barkerville would have called in special investigators to solve the mystery. He even managed to temporarily divert suspicion away from himself by framing Scooby. Even his capture at the end was the result of bad luck falling into a trap left by the gang, and not because he was chasing anyone unnecessarily. In fact, just the opposite, because it looked like he was trying to flee the scene when he fell into the pitfall. That's not to say his actions were completely flawless. His worst mistake had to have been where he hid the stolen sheep.
What have you done with my sheep, Bentley?
They're in the shed. Don't open that door!
Instead of making sure they were safely secured miles away from Barkerville Hall, or better yet, in the hands of some unscrupulous farmers willing to increase the size of their own herds, no questions asked, Bentley instead hid them in a relatively small shed not that far from the manor house. Sheep aren't exactly quiet animals, and they're not exactly known for loving enclosed spaces. So why in the hell would Bentley have kept them on the property as well as in a confined building? This would have virtually guaranteed their eventual discovery, especially as Lord Barkerville had at least 5 sheep herders in his employ, any one of which could have heard the sheep's bleating or had business inside the shed. To be fair to Bentley, it's always possible the shed was only ever intended to be a temporary enclosure for the livestock. He might have already made arrangements to dispose of them later, possibly with another local farm, and they were just waiting until no one else was around to move the animals. Indeed, in the aforementioned Sherlock Holmes story, The Adventure of Silver Blaze, the stolen horse at the center of the story was being held by a nearby neighbor. The writers could have borrowed this story element, too.
Scooby-Doo, where are you?
There he is! Scooby, are you all right?
Oh, hello.
One final thing I want to go over before wrapping up. Why did Scooby have wool in his ears? This was never answered in my version of the episode, making me wonder if there's a missing scene somewhere. I could see Scooby doing this to drown out the sound of Shaggy snoring while trying to get to sleep, or even later to prevent himself from becoming hypnotized by the ring. But neither of those things happened. He just showed up out of nowhere with wool shoved in his ears. Putting wool in his ears so he could sleep would not have worked because that would have kept him from hearing the ring and being hypnotized the first time. And he couldn't have put the wool in his ears while hypnotized because he would have already been under the ring's power. Yet when the gang found him, he had wool in his ears. So who put it there? I had access to 2 sources for this episode, and both matched up to within 1 second of each other. If anyone out there has a third version that explains this anomaly, please share it in the comments.
Is there any other point to which you wish to draw my attention, Mr. Holmes?
To the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime.
Bentley the caretaker made only one real mistake throughout the entire episode and had been successful enough that his employer was forced to call in outside help. He was also able to convince his boss and a torch-carrying mob that Scooby was the cause of all their difficulties. He gets a 4 out of 5 for the operation. This leaves the Hound of the Barkervilles with a final do score of 3 out of 5.
Thanks again, lads and lassie, for solving the mystery of the Hound.
Our pleasure, Lord Barkerville.
And thank you for wrongfully accusing our dog of stealing your sheep. Asshole. Seriously, Daphne and Shaggy forgave this guy way too easily. The gang stopped by a Mexican resort community to investigate the disappearance of a dinosaur researcher, allegedly taken by the reanimated prehistoric remains he had been excavating. It's up to them to unravel this Triassic tangle and put a stop to the Cretaceous Colossus. Okay, that's the last of the Paleozoic puns. It's enough to make anyone Jurassic puke.
Well, here we are in sunny Puerto Vallarta, Daphne. How far did you say it was to the village of San Pablo?
According to the map, it should be up the old mountain road, not far from here.
Puerto Vallarta is a real resort city in Mexico, but there aren't any villages named San Pablo in the vicinity. There are mountains, though, so the writers got that much correct.
And that's where the paleontologist Dr. LaRue is supposed to have been captured by a real dinosaur.
Dinosaur?
Dinosaur? Forget it.
What did the boys think they were doing in Mexico? Another vacation? You'd think they'd know better from the last time they thought a trip with Daphne was going to be relaxing. That makes me wonder, does she regularly wait until after they've arrived at a location before telling Shaggy and Scooby the reason for their trip? I don't blame her, but it's amazing those two still willingly go on any road trip with her. Dr. LaRue was an alleged paleontologist digging up the body of a dinosaur near the small Mexican village of San Pablo. In reality, Dr. LaRue was just a pseudonym adopted by a smuggler who had found the legendary lost silver mine of Montezuma. He'd also built a massive dinosaur robot to not only frighten villagers away from his operation, but also to house a smelter to process the stolen ore. The villain's real name is never revealed in the episode, so to keep things simple, I will continue to refer to him as LaRue. I won't be using the title of Doctor, however, as it's pretentious as hell for the bad guy to expect such respect. For all I know, his PhD could have been in marketing.
The dinosaur I've been excavating! It's alive!
Then again, for LaRue to have constructed such a realistic, massive, and complex machine like the dinosaur-shaped smeltery, he likely had advanced knowledge of engineering and metallurgy, not to mention animatronics and puppetry. Perhaps LaRue did deserve to be called Doctor after all. Then again, deciding to build a giant dinosaur to help you steal and smelt your stolen silver seems a bit overkill, and there had to have been an easier and far less obtrusive way to smuggle the metal. Transporting silver bars must have been more convenient than raw ore, but the latter could have been easily disguised as soil, and instead of a paleontologist, LaRue could have pretended to have been an excavator hired by a local farmer to dig a new well, or the foundation for a house. Jumping straight to giant dinosaurs stomping on villages is not indicative of a mind built for scholarly pursuits. Cartoon physics aside, someday we should discuss Scooby's ability to morph his body into ridiculous shapes to describe whatever monster is chasing him. I bring it up here because this is the most over-the-top example I've seen. Should we call it the Rickles-Rerect? It's becoming unavoidable to repeat myself, but by being able to create such a realistic life-size metal dinosaur, LaRue was wasting his talents as a silver smuggler. This was, after all, exactly 1 decade before the release of Jurassic Park. Between Cowabunga Carlyle's lifelike shark submarine and LaRue's mechanical dinosaur, Steven Spielberg could have saved a lot of time and money if he had these guys handling the effects for his movies. This is also the 3rd Spielberg reference in 2 of my videos in a row. I hope there isn't a future Scooby episode called Rindler's Wrist. The heart of LaRue's operation was smuggling, something that appears quite often in the Scooby-Doo-niverse, and precious metals was the contraband in question for several episodes. Dr. Coffin's crime in the Harem Scarum Sanitarium included smelting stolen gold to disguise its source, while stolen silver bars were at the heart of the Snake Demon's plot in Shiver and Shake, That Demon's a Snake. Even the choice of a giant mechanical dinosaur isn't new, as that was essentially what the Snow Beast was. Hell, the dragon Zalia Fairchild drove in the Sandy Duncan episode wasn't that far off from what's seen here. It would be lazy to simply call LaRue's scheme valuable and move on, but it's also difficult to pin down its worth with sufficient accuracy due to so many indeterminate variables, such as the carrying capacity of the truck, the quality of the silver bars he smelted, and what the precious metal sold for at the time this episode aired. I will make an attempt, but remember, these figures are very rough. Don't be filling my comment section with complaints about my math. The dump truck used by LaRue doesn't seem to conform to any real-life models and was likely just a rough approximation of one designed by Hanna-Barbera's artists. And as they were notorious for not maintaining consistency for their designs, even in the same episode, all I can do is estimate the dimensions of the vehicle's storage capacity. The bed of the dump truck looks to be about 12 feet long by 6 feet wide by 5 feet tall, which would give it a volume of 360 cubic feet. As shown, the silver bars were stacked beyond the capacity of the bed, but they were also not stacked uniformly, meaning there was plenty of empty space in the bed not taken up by silver. As much of this is guesswork based on estimations, I'm going to focus on how much silver would have filled the truck had it been packed neatly. 1 cubic foot of silver weighs around 650 pounds, or 9,500 troy ounces. 360 cubic feet would then be able to hold over 230,000 pounds, or 3.4 million troy ounces of silver. At the time this episode aired, silver was selling for around $12 per troy ounce, which would make the bars in LaRue's dump truck worth over $40 million at the time, or over $130 million in 2025. Pure silver ore is exceedingly rare, and the precious metal is usually extracted while processing other elements like copper and lead. In fact, it's a very laborious process that usually involves crushing and grinding the raw ore before mixing it with chemicals to separate the silver. It's seldom as simple as dropping some rocks in a furnace and burning away the dirt. Since it's not impossible, we'll give the writers the benefit of the doubt that the silver mine of Montezuma contained such valuable ore, and the bars produced by LaRue were of a high concentration of silver and not simply amalgams of silver, copper, and lead. Even then, those bars would not be 100% pure silver, but we'll hand-wave that for the sake of not getting too bogged down in the minutiae. LaRue's scheme was easily worth multiple millions of dollars, and while worth the risk of capture by the authorities, smuggling untraceable precious metals would also put him in the crosshairs of any criminal organizations that would catch wind of what he was up to. The Mexican crime cartels were just as active in the early 1980s, and despite their focus being primarily on drugs, it's likely they would jump at a chance at the large profits from stolen silver. It's also likely that they wouldn't be pleased with anyone operating an illegal operation in their territory without seeking permission or cutting them into the profits first. LaRue was risking a lot more than prison should he get caught. It's also possible that LaRue was working with a larger organization, which would explain how he had the resources to make the dinosaur. There's even a chance that, if captured by the police, he would be allowed to escape prison at the behest of the local cartel. Though it's also just as feasible he'd be disposed of to prevent him incriminating anyone, while the silver would be hijacked during transport to a government location. A lot of what I just said is pure supposition, so I'll stick to just what we saw in the episode, which was that the smuggler was working by himself, for himself, and rate him as such. LaRue's plan wasn't original and borrowed elements from several previous Scooby episodes. It was extremely valuable and likely worth the risk of police capture. However, he was putting his life in danger should any local cartel find out what he had been up to. He gets a 2 out of 5 for the design. I'm going to start off this section with an apology for the deceptive way I chose the background art for my video. The dinosaur head above me, in the background, and in the thumbnail suggests that the villain's disguise in this episode was the dinosaur, when in fact it was just the paleontologist persona. The dinosaur was a prop used by the bad guy, and thus technically won't factor into the outfit score. Please forgive me for going with what was more eye-catching. My channel analytics could always use the help. Channel analytics. Channel analytics. Channel analytics, 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 channel. God, why do I constantly write stuff like that for me to say out loud? I know how much trouble it's going to give me when I'm eventually in front of the camera. Past me expects way too much from current me. And future me is already annoyed enough knowing he's going to have to edit this crap. As mentioned, LaRue was not an actual scientist, or at least not the kind that researches dinosaurs, which means his outfit was essentially just Pitfall Harry. What he wore wasn't meant to frighten, but rather to blend in, and as LaRue was trying to convince the locals of the validity of his dinosaur prop, disguising himself as a relevant expert gave credence to his claims. As far as costumes go, this was at least a good choice. There's not much more to say than that. LaRue technically wore a disguise, but it wasn't worth much more than a villain who didn't wear one at all. He gets the usual neutral 2.5 out of 5 for the outfit score. This episode began like many in the Scooby-Doo-niverse, with a monster terrorizing locals and an abduction.
Fire! It is a monster! We must warn the village!
No! No! Get away! Help! Help! Put me
The victim here was also the episode's bad guy, so this kidnapping falls under E on the Fred scale. But did you notice anything unusual in the previous clip? Apart from the giant dinosaur crashing through the trees? Remember, the victim is actually this episode's villain. A villain who is purportedly working alone. So who's driving the dinosaur? As is common with E kidnappings, this was a mistake because LaRue's disappearance is what brought the gang to Mexico. However, even without the missing researcher angle, it's possible they might still have involved themselves as the case centered on a giant dinosaur. This just goes to show that the smuggler should have found a less ostentatious way to carry out his scheme.
A parasailer, how exciting!
Wow! Parachute sailing, let's go!
Come on, Scoob, relax. There's nothing to it.
Wait a minute. I thought they were there to investigate the missing paleontologist. Why are they stopping to parasail?
Right, Maggie?
Is he ready, Shaggy?
Yeah, he's ready.
No, he's clearly not ready. Scooby does not want to go up in that thing. This isn't like trying to shove your dog into the car for a trip to the vet. This is making a pet participate in a dangerous extreme sport against his will. Worst dog owners ever.
Uh-oh! Hang on! Whoa!
Shaggy had that coming to him. What kind of shit parasailing company were they running there? Or was this an indictment on Mexico's poorly regulated amusement industry? Better not get on any roller coasters while you're down there, guys.
We're heading for that village!
Oh, no!
Like this is it, Scoob!
Yeah, the villagers aren't going to want to be drinking that water for a while. Dr. LaRue never existed, so there wasn't a university he reported to or fellow researchers at the alleged dig site. So who summoned the gang to investigate his disappearance? The only witnesses to his abduction were a few local villagers who would have undoubtedly reported it to the local authorities. Would those officials have called a group of young amateur sleuths from another country to come down and solve the case for them? Especially as Mexico has its own intelligence agencies? Were the gang contacted by another criminal who wanted LaRue's plan to fail so they could get hold of the silver mine? Or did LaRue call them himself to divert suspicion from his actions? If so, that wasn't the smartest thing he could have done.
I fell in a hole!
That's not a hole, Scrappy. It looks like a dinosaur footprint.
Well, whatever it sure is oily. Yeah, and there's more of that oil here, too.
What oil? Whoops!
That oil!
Look there. It's a trail of oil puddles.
Gotta get those kids off the trail.
The producers didn't seem to care about maintaining the mystery element of this one by waiting until the end to reveal the bad guy, did they? The biggest clue that the dinosaur wasn't real was all the puddles of oil found in the village and jungle, creating a trail that led the gang directly to both the dinosaur and the lost silver mine. I might have to reevaluate my earlier praise for LaRue's engineering skills. A well-built robot does not spew oil everywhere.
I see him. Let me at him. I'll teach him to be extinct.
No! Wait, Scrappy!
Take that!
No, Scrappy!
Come on, Daphne. We'll be on top of this mystery in no time. Say, where'd that dumb dinosaur go anyway, Daphne?
He's around here somewhere, Scrappy.
For detectives, the gang aren't very good at paying attention to their surroundings. Even after they entered what was clearly a fake dinosaur, which Scrappy said he saw and was why he attacked the tail which opened the entry, they exited the mouth asking where the monster went. Even Inspector Clouseau would be wondering what the merde the Scooby Gang was doing.
Hey, Hey, like what's a roller coaster doing up here?
Get off that quick, Shaggy. I warned you not to get on any roller coasters down there.
Did you see that? Did you see that?
That so-called dinosaur must be some kind of silver processor.
How did the gang miss all that when they were just inside that thing?
And he's getting away!
Not if I can help it.
Scrappy, wait!
Yeah, wait!
Happy hour!
Wait a minute. If you guys are hanging out on top of the head, who's driving the dinosaur? Oh, it must be either Daphne or Shaggy.
Zoinks! It's Scrappy and Scooby!
Come on, Shaggy, let's help them!
Wait a minute. Why weren't Daphne and Shaggy inside the dinosaur with the dogs? They all ran to it at the same time.
Oh no!
Wait a minute. Nobody was driving the dinosaur?
Oh!
You should have been wearing your seatbelt, Doc.
So that's it! The old crane and the computerized dinosaur suit trick!
The animators had to have known what their drawing looked like. Right? LaRue does get some credit for being able to successfully smelt all that silver ore and for building a convincing mechanical dinosaur. But he loses just as much for failing to do more to ensure the success of his scheme. Setting aside finding a less conspicuous way of carrying out his smuggling operation, since, as a rule, smugglers usually try to remain low-key, not Loki-Ceratops. God damn it, Joe. LaRue didn't do enough to stop the snoopers from finding his operation. For as much as the stolen silver was worth, the smuggler should have, you know. This was a jungle which offered plenty of places to bury some bodies in secrecy, or enough scavengers to make much of the biological evidence disappear. Not to mention, the villagers were already convinced a rampaging dinosaur was on the loose, offering a convenient explanation should anyone from the U.S. contact local Mexican authorities after not having heard from their son or daughter in a few weeks. Apart from whoever rented the parasail to them, there didn't seem to be anyone else who could have provided clues as to where the Americans had gone. A few villagers had seen Shaggy and Scooby land in their well, but this was immediately followed by the dinosaur attack, which would have made them forget all about the two pendejos who contaminated their water supply. LaRue kidnapped himself, which, as usual, was not a bright idea. His mechanical dinosaur bled oil everywhere, which ended up revealing the lost silver mine, and he didn't take steps to silence any witnesses to his extremely valuable crime. He did manage to get pretty far with his scheme, though, so he wasn't a complete failure. LaRue gets a 2 out of 5 for the operation. This leaves the deceitful dinosaur dude with a final do score of 2.2 out of 5.
Zoinks! A real dinosaur! Yeah!
Oh, Shaggy.
What? Hey, Steven Spielberg, forget the mechanical dinosaur. By the time you get around to making Jurassic Park, this guy should be fully grown. I would like to take a moment to thank my new paid supporters on Patreon and YouTube and apologize in advance if I mispronounce any names. Pennyman Webtoon. Thank you, Pennyman Webtoon. Scott Brigden. Thank you, Scott Brigden. Andreas Buckley. Thank you, Andreas Buckley. Andreas Buckley. Thank you, Andreas Buckley. Wolfsbane Tree. Thank you, Wolfsbane Tree. Telmachus 2814. Thank you, Telmachus 2814. Thank you to everyone helping support my channel. It absolutely means the world to me. If you'd like to help, there's a link to my Patreon page in the video description, or you can click the join button somewhere at the bottom of this video to become a YouTube channel member. But please, only if you're comfortable doing so. Supporters receive credit in my videos for as long as they remain a paid member, as well as a personal shout-out in the next regular video produced after they join. If you're interested in picking up some clothing or mugs, there's a link to my merch store in the video description. If you send me a photo wearing or holding anything you buy, I would love to include it in my next regular video. This means you are giving me permission to share it if you send it to me. No takebacks. Hillside High School is being terrorized by a giant green monster, allegedly created by a science lab experiment gone wrong. Unfortunately for the creature, one of the students is the cousin of Daphne Blake, who calls in her detective relative to put a stop to the shenanigans.
Wah, wah, wah. Whisper, wah.
I suppose if Shaggy can still look and dress like a 1950s beatnik, it's okay for Scooby to be wearing a 1950s high school turtleneck sweater.
Oh, I'm so freaked out. My famous reporter cousin Daphne Blake coming to my school to investigate the creature. Like, isn't it tubular, Scooby?
Please tell me she is not going to be speaking Valley Girl the entire episode. I would rather listen to a full season of Lenny Weinrib voicing Scrappy.
Here's his picture in the school newspaper. Like, isn't he grody? Grody to the max.
If her accent makes me cringe any further, my butthole is going to swallow my head. Toby Wallace was a popular student at Hillside High School. He was also pirating popular video games for profit, which he produced at night in the school's computer lab. To avoid being discovered, he tried getting all the after-school activities canceled by frightening away the rest of the students and staff using a monster disguise, the creature from Chem Lab. We've seen media piracy before in the Scooby-Dooverse, specifically in the second season of the Scooby-Doo show when the villains behind the pterodactyl ghost produced bootleg music albums. That was a sophisticated operation involving an entire team of criminals producing thousands of phony vinyl records. Here, it's just a single teenager using school equipment without permission to copy a handful of games.
He dropped this!
A computer disc. We better take this disc to the school's computer room and find out what's on it.
There may be nothing on that disc at this point, since Daphne is holding the floppy with her fingers over the hole. I said access hole, not hole. Her skin may not be magnetic, but any dirt or oil on her fingers won't be doing the exposed magnetic media any favors. That's why you generally put those things in paper sleeves to be safe. You didn't have to be a nerd to know that is not the way to handle a floppy. Even Shaggy knew the proper way to hold one. Often in these older Scooby shows, I've had to ignore what the producers put on screen because focusing on their animation or design mistakes would derail my entire video. This episode is a good example of that, starting with the floppy disks used by Toby. The one shown in Daphne's hand is much bigger than usual and thus likely to have been an 8-inch disc, which was typically used by corporate or industrial computers in the 1970s and early 1980s. While it would make sense for the Hillside High School mainframe to utilize that size media, most popular home computers in 1983, the year this episode aired, all used the smaller 5¼ inch floppy disks. It's possible that Toby was producing pirated copies for those older industrial systems, but there wasn't much of a market for video games for that type of computer user. Which brings us to the second thing about the real world we must ignore for this villain plot not to unravel before it even began. These days, most home computer video games are written for PCs running Microsoft Windows, which makes pirating them fairly straightforward as their potential buyers would be almost universal. However, in 1983, the year this episode aired, there were several competing home computer systems on the market, each with their own operating system, and a game coded for one would not work for the others. Trust me, at the time it was a nightmare being a computer gamer. If you were lucky enough to even find a store that sold computer games, you had to hope they not only had the version for your computer manufacturer, but also for whatever model you had at home. Say what you will about the evils of a monopoly, and monopolies are absolutely evil, having one operating system on nearly 3/4 of the world's computers makes it a lot easier to find software that will run on your system. Why am I bringing up software compatibility? Toby was using the school's mainframe to copy game disks, presumably to sell to home users. It's practically guaranteed that whatever operating system was installed on the school's computer would not be compatible with any of the home computers Toby or his customers would own. Even setting aside the media size incompatibility, if you stuck a Commodore 64 disk into almost any corporate mainframe, all you would get would be a screen filled with error messages. Technically, it is possible that Toby was such an amazing computer genius that he was able to create a program that would have allowed the school mainframe to emulate whatever home computer ran the software he was trying to pirate. He could have also created a program that allowed the system to mirror whatever was on a floppy disk without actually needing to be able to run any of the programs on it. Either of those is asking quite a lot from a high school jock, especially as the kid thought dressing up in a green foam rubber monster suit was the best way to carry out his plan. Sure, nerds at the time were pretty out there, but that's taking it to a whole new level. For the sake of not writing off the entire episode as being entirely impossible, we'll suspend our disbelief enough to accept that whatever games Toby was pirating were compatible enough with the school's mainframe for him to use it to make copies. I'll even be generous enough not to dwell on how cumbersome making copies of floppy disks used to be without access to actual factory software production equipment. While later upgrades would speed up the process, for most home users in 1983, the year this episode aired, it could often take up to 2 minutes to copy a single floppy disk, though this time would be reduced if the user had access to multiple drives. This means that Toby could only produce, at best, 30 to 60 copies per hour. Another factor to consider when determining whether this scheme was practical was the cost of the blank floppy disks. At the time, they sold anywhere from $5 to $15 each, or around $16 to $50 per disk in 2025. If you managed to buy the lowest quality in bulk, you might have been able to get it down to $2 to $3 each, or around $5 to $10 per disk in 2025. Not having to pay for a computer to make the copies and saving labor costs by doing everything himself would have helped Toby keep his overhead down, but this was still a significant out-of-pocket expense for a high school student. That would still work, though, if Toby was selling the copies at retail price, assuming his customers thought they were getting legitimate copies. At the beginning of the 1980s, many computer video games retailed for anywhere between $30 to $50, which would be $100 to $150 in 2025. However, as mentioned, this episode aired in 1983, a year famous for a massive crash in the North American video game market, caused by a glut of terrible releases which drove the prices of video games down to bargain bin amounts. It wasn't unheard of for games that originally retailed for $30 to be marked down to $5 or less. While the crash mostly centered on games for consoles like the Atari 2600, its impact could still be felt in the home computer game market, despite an uptick of consumers going that direction. Why would anyone pay Toby $30 for a game they could purchase at their nearest Sears for less than the cost of a floppy disk?
Now to find out what's on this disc, Scrappy.
That is not how a floppy disk is inserted into a computer. A cartridge sticks out, but a disk goes fully inside the drive. Bottom line, unless you had access to free or massively discounted computer floppy disks, 1983 was not the best year to get into video game piracy for profit. Which brings up another point about Toby's scheme. What kind of software pirate was he? In my experience, there were two types. First, you had the casual hobbyist making or sharing copies between friends, at most charging the buyer the cost of the disk and maybe $1 for the time they spent copying it. Then you had the sophisticated hardcore bootlegger who not only made multiple copies of a popular game, but also did their best to wrap their product to make it look as legitimate as possible. The floppy disks we saw had no labels, while the video games in Toby's locker were properly packaged. The designs were generic, but whether this was supposed to be how they were sold retail, and Hanna-Barbera didn't make them look flashy enough, or if these were handwritten by Toby cannot be determined. They could have been the master floppy disks he purchased to make copies from later, which, by the way, would only add more to the startup costs to his scheme if he paid full retail for each of those games. Professional piracy in the early 1980s wasn't that widespread in the United States as opposed to outside the country where criminal organizations would produce bootleg copies to be sold in retail stores. In America, piracy was often non-profit, with proto-hackers cracking games for fun and prestige before uploading them to computer bulletin board systems for anyone to freely download, with local computer clubs often trading such releases between members. Personally, I got a real kick out of the villain's plot in this one. Back in my preteen years, my family owned a Commodore 64, and I was part of a local computer club where we would, in fact, trade pirated video games with each other. Yes, folks, apparently I had what it takes to be an actual Scooby villain. It's hard not to conclude that regardless of whatever marginal profits Toby made, they were nowhere near worth enough to risk getting caught breaking into the school at night to use the computer lab without permission, let alone the chaos of unleashing his monster on the campus. Then again, to a dumb high school kid, what most adults would consider not worth their time might have seemed like enough money to risk expulsion or even a trip to juvie. Prison was never going to be an option for a minor like Toby, or at least I assume he was a minor. If he was a high school senior, he could have been 18, so prison was a possibility, although it's unlikely a judge would sentence him to that, assuming it was his first offense for what was essentially a victimless white-collar crime.
It's the creature! He's back! Help! 6 bits ago!
Wickles effect, yeah, but where did the creature get that bucket? There were only 2 of them on the floor before he opened the door, and there were still 2 buckets after he crushed the one in his hands. And he was clearly not holding anything when he first arrived.
Here, run!
I mentioned it before in a much earlier video, but it's not so easy popping a football. Wickles effect again.
But I needed the money.
You spoiled everyone's fun for your own selfishness? Well, you can just bag it, Toby.
Right, rag it.
And figure out a way to pay for all the damages.
Professor Marsden mentioned that Toby needed to figure out a way to pay for all the damages. But in the entire episode, the only damage done by the creature was squishing a mop bucket and popping a football. That's probably less than $25 worth of damage for 1983, unless Marsden was talking about the legal damages for pirating all that computer software. But why would the professor care about that? Media piracy wasn't an original plot device, and Toby's plan could not have been that profitable, with a limited audience and relatively high startup costs. However, as a minor, presumably, even if he got caught, the penalties were likely to be very small and his chances of seeing the inside of a courtroom were negligible. The video game industry had a lot more on their mind at the time than wanting to press charges against a high school student for a penny anti-piracy scheme. Toby gets a 2 out of 5 for the design. In the early days of my villain rankings, the worst generic outfit was usually a bad guy wearing either a sheet or a hood. Now it's starting to become blob monsters, as we're only 4 episodes into this series, and we've already come across the second one. I will give the designers credit that using lobster pincers for hands was an interesting touch, though we already saw something similar once before with the creepy heap from the deep. The creature here also had cloven feet, which is not something seen that often either. Usually, Scooby monsters walk on 4 or 5-toed claws. The yellow eyes on the mask, though, are extremely common for the franchise. The outfit also featured no special effects, making this an overall lazy design. I wouldn't even call it particularly frightening either, as despite the claws looking like they could cause a nasty pinch, we never actually saw them snap at anyone during any point in the episode. At best, the creature just tried to bear hug its victims. Not scary, not original, except for maybe its extremities, boring, and with no special effects, the creature from ChemLab gets an outfit score of 1.5 out of 5. By the time the Scooby Gang arrived, Tony had managed to disrupt a single pep rally and get at least one extracurricular event canceled. We don't know, though, if he managed to sell any pirated video games, as nothing like that was revealed. All it would have taken was a line at the end saying something like, Toby was the source of all those fake games that the newspaper reported. Earlier Scooby series often mentioned a crime at the beginning, but that's sorely lacking here, likely due to the fact that each segment is half an episode in length, so the writers didn't have time to properly establish things.
It's the creature from ChemLab! Run for your lives! Yeah, and he's ugly, too.
For sure, for sure. But he only comes out at night.
And they mostly come at night. Mostly.
Wait a minute. If the creature only comes out at night, why was it attacking the pep rally during the day? That brings us to Toby's first mistake. He only needed the school to be empty at night, so appearing during the day was not only pointless, but it just increased the danger of getting caught should the faculty actually act like faculty and call the police to investigate. Even if no one was hurt, classes and activities were still being disrupted, which meant someone in authority needed to do something. This also brings up another point. It's unlikely the high school would have had a dance or football game every single evening. Instead of dressing as a monster and running the risk of the principal calling the police, why didn't Toby just wait to do his pirating on days that didn't have any nighttime events scheduled? This raises yet another question. How did he gain access to the computer lab after hours? Let alone breaking into the school itself, Professor Marsden would have undoubtedly locked the door before leaving for the day. Hell, rather than scaring away students and faculty to get after-school events canceled, it would have been better for Toby to have spent those evenings in the computer lab, because not only would the doors to the school have been unlocked, but anyone who might want access to the school's computers would likely be in the gym. They often videotaped the games after all, and it was usually the computer nerds who were tapped to run the cameras. With this, all Toby would have needed was a copy of the computer lab's key, which he could have stolen from either Professor Marsden or the janitorial staff. It's not like security was tight, considering 2 visitors with 2 unleashed dogs were allowed to wander the place unaccompanied and get into trouble.
Ribbit.
You're in a science lab, Scooby. Best not to get too emotionally attached to that frog.
Ribbit.
Hey, you froggies, get back in your cage.
Yeah, Scrappy's right. Get back here. You guys have a date with a jar of chloroform. Seriously, how many kids watching this back in the day could have known exactly why there'd be so many frogs in a science lab? By allowing all those lab specimens to escape, the Scooby Gang likely cost the school much more money than Toby did as the creature from Chem Lab.
Huh? Look, Scooby's found something.
Good work, Scoob. It looks like the creature's skin.
Just how badly did the animators not want to draw the rest of Daphne in this scene? That's literally her entire arm in the frame with no other part of her body shown. She'd have had to have reached uncomfortably downward to pick up that clue.
Guess what I found out? The creature's skin is just painted foam rubber.
The reveal that the creature was fake came at the halfway point of the episode. Just like how the previous one revealed early on that LaRue was the bad guy following the gang. By this point in the franchise, it really feels like the producers had lost all desire to maintain any sense of mystery. I almost had a small existential crisis over this scene. In my entire life, I had never heard of a separate device for drying dishes. I thought maybe this was something used in large commercial kitchens, but found nothing online about such equipment, despite my wife telling me that they were featured in the training videos at her job. Every internet search I ran for dish drying appliances returned results that solely mentioned the heating elements that come built in with a dishwasher. However, I did find a countertop dish dryer for sale at Walmart. I eventually stopped looking after realizing I had spent twice the time trying to make sense of this one moment than the entire runtime of the episode.
Puppy power!
Why was the villain holding the disc in his hand? The creature wasn't seen with it prior to that point. It would have made sense had Daphne or Shaggy found the disc on the ground and the creature yanked it from their hands. But as seen in the episode, between chasing the boys into the laundry room and Scrappy hitting him with the cart, Toby had purposely taken the disc out from, presumably, the inside of his costume just so he could drop it immediately afterward. I would guess the script said the disc was knocked out of the creature's outfit after the cart's impact, and the rushed animators simply did a poor job of rendering it. But that's no excuse for the background artist making the D in laundry look like an O.
The answer is probably inside his locker. Just as I suspected. Toby's been using the computer room at night to make copies of video games.
Why did Toby keep the evidence of his crime in his school locker? Even setting aside that it was left unlocked so that anyone could have opened it and found the computer disks, it wasn't uncommon, even back in the early to mid-1980s, for schools to do random locker checks for drugs or other contraband. This was one of the worst places Toby could have picked to hide any evidence, especially if Professor Marsden discovered the school's computer was being used without authorization. All that software in Toby's personal school locker would have directly linked him to the crime. It's a good thing nobody was in there changing. That's a high school locker room. You don't just barge into areas where underage girls could be changing their clothes.
The bell! Oh boy!
If this was a high school, why did all the students look like they were in their late 20s or early 30s? Finally, Toby was captured in one of the most pathetic ways possible, practically on par with sliding down a ramp and getting tangled in a bunch of furniture. Carl the stuntman. Toby needlessly dressed as the creature, dropped 2 important clues, including evidence that his outfit was fake, kept the computer disks that would immediately reveal him as the culprit where anyone could find them, and was embarrassingly easy to capture. He might have earned at least an extra half point if there had been any mention of him actually selling a few pirated games, but as it was, Toby gets a 1 out of 5 for the operation. This leaves the creature from Chem Lab with a final do score of 1.5 out of 5.
Right, ragged.
Wow! Scooby's line would have sounded horrible taken out of context. Daphne, Shaggy, and the dogs visit her family's mansion, where her parents are hosting a costumed ball, intending to auction off a valuable stamp for charity. Little did they know that an unexpected guest is also planning on making an appearance. An infamous cat burglar known for leaving a playing card at the scene of his crimes, who now has his sights set on the piece of prized postage.
Oh boy, we're gonna go swimming and play volleyball and tennis. This vacation will be a blast, won't it, Uncle Scooby?
Just how tall is the ceiling in the back of the van? The Mystery Machine really is pretty much the TARDIS at this point.
Like at least this is one old mansion where we won't have to worry about ghouls and goblins. Right, Scoob?
Yeah, ghouls and goblins.
Shaggy is 6 foot tall, but the door handles are almost at the height of his head. Who were those doors built for? Gamera?
Oh boy, like I spoke too soon!
Come back here, guys. I want you to meet our butler, Klaus.
Daphne has known the boys for years and had to have known how they would likely react to her family's creepy butler, but she didn't bother giving them a heads up. I think it's fair to say Daphne simply enjoys tormenting Shaggy and Scooby. Milo Damp was the alter ego of the notorious Masked Manx, a prolific thief with a penchant for the dramatic, as he would leave his calling card, the Ace of Spades, in place of whatever item he stole. He infiltrated the Blake mansion by pretending to be a detective, all to steal the prized faulty phoenix, a rare postage stamp worth millions.
Ah, this is the most important part of the party.
A stamp?
It's called Faulty Phoenix, and it's the most valuable stamp in the world.
Wait a minute. The stamp was just sitting at the bottom of an open dish? I thought it was inside a sealed container with a transparent cover. Even the cheapest stamps collected by the most amateur philatelists are kept safely in binders. Stamps worth millions of dollars are mounted in acid-free sleeves under UV glass and kept in low-light, climate-controlled rooms. Perhaps the villain is doing the world a favor by stealing the faulty phoenix if it means getting it into the hands of a collector who will treat it with more care. Before diving into the design, let's take a moment to try and make some sense of the episode's setup.
Philo Damp, Private Eye.
Mr. Damp, so good of you to come.
Well, when I heard you were auctioning off a valuable stamp, I thought you might need my services.
This scene was problematic. Presumably, all the guests in attendance would have been invited by the Blake family. Furthermore, as the whole point of the ball was to auction off an extremely rare and expensive stamp, it stands to reason that all the guests would be very wealthy. So why did they invite a private investigator who was unlikely to be able to make any bids? It would have made more sense for Milo Damp to be there if he had been hired as security. But his line about having heard they were auctioning off the faulty phoenix and thought they might need his services implied that he had shown up uninvited.
And so Philo Damp was the masked Manx all along. His private eye agency was a phony, just to cover for his crimes.
I have issues with this line as well. If the masked Manx had simply invented the Milo Damp persona this one time to infiltrate the Blake mansion, that would be one thing. But Daphne's statement that he used his agency to camouflage his crimes would imply that he had been an established private detective for some time and that he used his position to gain access to locations where he could steal valuables. This is supported by the fact that the Blakes weren't suspicious when Milo Damp arrived at the ball without an invitation, understanding that he had been a famous and trusted private investigator. It's important to make all this clear because it had a direct impact on how risky the scheme was to the villain. It would have been considered extremely suspicious had well-known detective Milo Damp been at the scene of all the masked Manx crimes, and he would have at least been held by the police for questioning. If, however, Milo Damp was just a pseudonym adopted by the masked Manx for this one crime, he could steal the stamp and fade into obscurity, leaving his victims kicking themselves for believing the fake private eye story. I am forced to conclude Milo Damp was a well-known private investigator, as the conversation he had with Daphne's mom made it clear his identity was known ahead of time and that it was okay for him to crash the party. A private ball for rich people is not a place where random peasants are considered welcome. This means that Milo Damp's plan was extremely risky for him because he put himself directly at the scene of the crime with no real alibi other than his claim that he was there to help. All this confusion could have been avoided if it had been established that the Blakes had hired the real Milo Damp as security for the faulty phoenix, and the masked Manx had abducted the detective to take his place.
And this is where people will be dancing tonight.
A marble dance floor!
Whoa!
Apparently, Daphne's father enjoys tormenting the boys as well. That must be where she gets it from.
Ah, you found the free samples of Blake's bubble bath for the guests tonight.
For rich people, a free bubble bath is kind of a shit gift. Hell, that'd be a shit gift for just about anyone. As for the value of Milo Damp's scheme, this is another one of those situations where just because something is worth a lot of money doesn't mean the villain can make a profit from it. Stealing gold or silver or loose gems is usually worth it because they can be sold to just about anyone. But when it comes to fencing famous objects like works of art or postage stamps, the market is greatly reduced to only wealthy families who are sleazy enough to knowingly pay for stolen goods. The faulty phoenix was said to be the most famous stamp in the world. So who in the hell would Milo Damp sell it to? It's not like he could show up at a pawn shop or philatelist convention and look for someone with deep pockets. Everyone would know the stamp was stolen, and it would only be a matter of time before someone called the police. Without buyers, the most valuable objects in the world are essentially worthless. It would make a lot more sense if Milo Damp had been hired by an unscrupulous stamp collector to steal it. But if that wasn't the case, his best bet would have been to hold it for ransom. I am willing to give the writers the benefit of the doubt on this one. If the masked Manx was indeed a very accomplished thief, he likely did have a buyer already lined up for the faulty phoenix. He clearly wasn't robbing places on impulse if he was willing to disguise himself or set up a phony detective agency to gain access to places like the Blake Mansion. I concede that his scheme was valuable and worth the risk of capture. Milo Damp's crime doesn't win any points for originality, however, as the episode The Ghoul, the Bat, and the Ugly from 4 years earlier also centered around stolen postal collectibles. Come to think of it, everyone treated those rare stamps just as carelessly as the one in this episode. There's not much more to say about the villain's plan. It was not original, but it was well worth the risk of capture. However, Milo Damp only increased that risk by showing up to the mansion as himself. He gets a 2.5 out of 5 for the design. So, that costume, huh? I was seriously tempted to just give it a 1 for the outfit score and move on, but I will do my best to provide a little analysis.
Nobody would have figured it out if I hadn't dropped that magnifying glass.
That's right. His magnifying glass was an important part of his costume.
A case could be made that Milo Damp himself was the disguise and deserves some discussion. And Daphne's comment about the magnifying glass being part of his costume would support that. Except as mentioned earlier, there was uncertainty as to whether or not Milo Damp was a real detective, so I'm going to let this slide and focus only on the gorilla suit. Original? Nope. Special effects? Nope. Scary? Nope. Appropriate? Maybe, since this was a costumed ball, but that just meant nobody should have been fooled by the gorilla outfit because so many were already wearing animal disguises. Sure, Shaggy and Scooby ran from it, but come on. They're Shaggy and Scooby. Milo Damp gets a 1 out of 5 for the outfit. Overall, this was a fairly straightforward crime, and Milo Damp should have easily succeeded. The faulty phoenix was left out in the open in the unguarded library, and it should have been a simple matter for him to sneak in when nobody was looking, slip the stamp into a wallet or other unobtrusive hiding spot on his person, then leave the mansion before the theft was discovered. Unfortunately, Milo Damp overcomplicated the scheme far more than necessary. First, arriving early and declaring his intention to help safeguard the place would only make his leaving after the stamp disappeared suspicious as hell, as it would practically be shouting his guilt. Having to maintain his cover as a private detective would make it difficult for Milo Damp to make a clean getaway under any circumstance. This is, of course, if I was working under the assumption that he was an established private investigator. And I am.
And I am.
There's another gorilla suit in here just like yours.
Oh, it was a 2 for the price of 1 sale. I couldn't resist.
Second, wearing the gorilla costume was just baffling. That could not have been Milo Damp's plan before he arrived, because it's dubious he would have known that Daphne's father had purchased identical gorilla suits. Unless he was really playing 4-dimensional chess and had disguised himself as the clerk at the costume store to convince Mr. Blake to buy the 2 suits. Nah, I don't give the writers of this series that much credit.
Like, look what Scooby found to wear.
Scooby-Doo.
It's been a while since we've seen Scooby in drag.
Excuse me, Mr. Blake?
Hold on there!
The gorilla suit was not only impractical, but it was also cumbersome to move around in. Worse, it didn't have any pockets, which meant until he could find a private spot to remove the costume to get access to his normal clothing, Milo Damp had to hold the faulty phoenix in his hand. This led directly to him losing the stamp after slipping on Scooby's banana peel. Meticulous planning is often not enough for any endeavor, and a willingness to accept some amount of improvisation can sometimes mean the difference between success and failure. However, Milo Damp wearing the gorilla suit before stealing the stamp was a critical error. Had he simply sneaked into the library wearing his normal clothes with all the hiding spots they afforded, he never would have dropped it in the first place, and he could have left the mansion in safety. Was it even necessary for Milo Damp to attend the ball? His fame as a notorious and successful cat burglar would imply he was talented at breaking and entering. And there was a large, unbarred, ground floor window in the library. Why didn't he just sneak onto the estate in whatever clothing he normally wore on the job and steal the stamp that way? Appearing in person in front of a large group of witnesses was just asking for trouble. Then again, could he have attempted to steal the stamp that way earlier in a scene that wasn't animated? Let's look at another clue he left behind.
Look, there's broken glass by the window.
This magnifying glass has Dad's initial on it. When he broke it, he had to steal Daddy's to replace it so no one would suspect.
I see. That was the broken glass we saw in the library.
This means Milo Damp somehow managed to drop 2 separate magnifying glasses as clues. Perhaps disguising himself as a private detective wasn't the best choice for Mr. Butterfingers. Is it possible that Milo Damp had tried sneaking into the library earlier, found the window wasn't able to be opened, and had to adjust his plans accordingly? Did he try opening the window first before taking the stamp and somehow dropped his magnifying glass then? Spooked by the noise it made, Milo Damp might have then left the room in a panic without cleaning up the broken glass he left behind. That could be why he chose to wear the second gorilla disguise, because his original escape plan was no longer available. That still doesn't let Milo Damp off the hook for not hiding the faulty phoenix somewhere inside his costume before leaving the room. After all, my theory was just a way of making sense out of the broken glass, considering the entire time Milo Damp was shown in the library, he was never seen holding his own magnifying glass. Just Mr. Blake's that had been left on the dish holding the stamp. The episode never explained when or how he had broken his own.
Heavens, what's this?
An ace of spades. That's the calling card of the masked Manx.
Yes, be sure to touch the card and ruin any potential fingerprints the police might find on it. Daphne's mom probably wasn't a trained detective, but even she should have known better. It's possible that between the moment he placed his calling card on the dish and hid beside the library door, Milo Damp may have tried taking off his costume to secure the stamp inside his street clothes. At that moment, his magnifying glass might have fallen out of his jacket and shattered on the floor. If that was the case, it's just further evidence that dressing up as the gorilla was dumb.
Dum, 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 dum.
Stop! Don't look anymore, Buck!
No, not that door!
Wow! Like, what a great costume!
Shaggy was wearing a real suit of armor. Instead of treading water, he should have been stuck at the bottom of the pool, holding his breath and desperately praying that someone realized he was trapped down there.
Oh, my! Oh, great!
As usual, the Scooby villain's final mistake was getting involved in an uncontrollable chase that ended with their capture. In this situation, riding zoo animals into a swimming pool. I suppose it wasn't the worst way things could have ended for a guy in a gorilla suit. F***ing Carl the Stuntman.
This is what I call a party.
Oh, no!
Huh? That crazy canine got the stamp back.
I wonder how much the stamp was going to be worth now that it was soaked in chlorinated pool water and bubble bath. Milo Damp managed to get inside the Blake mansion and temporarily steal the faulty phoenix. But wearing the gorilla suit was a poor use of improvisation, and dropping not one, but 2 separate magnifying glasses was showing far more carelessness than expected from a supposedly renowned cat burglar. He gets a 1.5 out of 5 for the operation. This leaves the masked Manx with a final due score of 1.7 out of 5.
It's the Hooskow for you, buddy.
Hooskow? That was an antiquated term, even for the 1980s. Who was that cop? Chief O'Hara? And that's my Am I recording? Yes. And that's my ranking of the villains from the second set of episodes of the first season of the new Scooby and Scrappy-Doo show, shown here along with the ones from my previous video. This one ended up longer than expected, as all 4 segments included an actual villain this time around. It's probably too late for me to change my 2 episodes per video format, so I'll just have to muscle through. As for the bad guys featured, things started off strongly with a score that finally broke into the 3s. Barely. But then they dropped right back down. I want to once again reiterate that I try my best not to go into these episodes with any preconceived notions as to how well the villains will perform. And there are times when I have prolonged debates with myself over the scores I assign. Those are usually the ones that include a half point. Fingers crossed we see better bad guys in the next one. I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon below, or you can become one of my YouTube channel members by clicking the join button. But please only if you're comfortable doing so. Supporters receive credit in my videos for as long as they remain a paid member, as well as a personal shout out in the next regular video produced after they join. There's also a link to my merch store where you can pick up clothing or mugs. If you send me a photo wearing or holding anything you buy, I would love to include it in my next regular video. This means you are giving me permission to share it if you send it to me. No takebacks. Why did Scooby have wool in his ears? Who was driving the dinosaur? What was the deal with that dish dryer in the school cafeteria? Was Milo Damp a real detective or not?
Who am I? What am I?